Hello, this is Chris Heiser from University of Pennsylvania and Internet 2, and this is an LDAP demo of group attributes that are provisioned flat, which means the group name is going to be the RDN, which is usually the CN in LDAP, but that could be overridden so that groups could actually live anywhere in LDAP. So I've got a pretty basic grouper set up here, though I do have a LDAP with some data and a subject source setup. You can look at the demo 5 from scratch to see how that is set up. So I'm just going to pull up a user, A. Clark, and look at their subject attributes. Basically, the subject ID is going to be the UID in LDAP, but for this example, we want to do something a little bit more complicated in case that's not the case. So we have the mail attribute, which is the email in grouper. And if we just look at that subject source configuration, we can see that the mail is a subject identifier. And since that's the only subject identifier, in the subject source config, in the field mapping, you get an attribute name for net ID. That's what we call subject identifier 0, and that's the mail attribute. So if you're using subject identifier 0, it's a little bit easier than using a different subject identifier because the subject doesn't need to be resolved. This subject identifier 0 is cached in grouper. So let's we'll start by making a new provisioner. For configuration ID, we'll just do something descriptive. This is an LDAP provisioner. We have one LDAP external system. We're going to operate on memberships, and we're only operating on our LDAP subjects. We're doing group attributes because the memberships are an attribute of a group. We're going to select memberships, insert, delete. We'll delete memberships if not in grouper. We're going to operate on groups, of course. We're going to select groups so we can compare. We're going to add groups that aren't there. We'll delete groups that aren't in grouper. We will update groups, and generally the main object in LDAP has a link. So in this case we're doing group attributes, so there's a group link, which means we're looking up groups by JID number, and then we retrieve the DN, which is how LDAP refers to the group. So we're going to have a group link there. For the search-based DN, we'll look at our LDAP, and I created a new OU for grouper groups. So this is where the flat groups will go. For the group search filter, we'll let grouper figure that out. And for the group search all filter, we'll let grouper figure that out. Basically what this is going to do in an override situation is it's going to find all the groups in the search-based DN that have certain object classes, and for the group search filter, it's also going to look for the JID number. If the DN is being overridden, then it's just going to search by that DN. So it's a little bit of a complicated algorithm there, but grouper will take care of that. We are going to allow DN overrides, and we'll show those. RDN for groups. Let's check our LDAP. I have an OU with some groups, and basically the CN is the first part of the DN, which is the relative DN. So the RDN is CN, and since that's the default, we don't need to put anything here. If it was something other than CN, we would map that attribute and pick it here after we've mapped the attribute. So we're doing flat, not bushy. Now for the group attributes, we need the DN, we need the CN, we need the JID number, we need the object class, and we need the membership attribute. So let's do 5 attributes for that. We'll start with the DN. The DN in grouper LDAP provisioning is a field named name. Value type is string, so you can leave this blank because it's the default value. It's not multi-valued. For multi-valued, we're not looking to see if something is LDAP multi-valued. We're looking to see if the representation that grouper is using for LDAP has multiple values. So generally this is going to be false except for memberships and object classes. We're going to select the DN. We're going to insert it, obviously. And if groups are moved, we'll change the DN. This is not the matching ID. The matching ID is going to be the JID number. The search attribute is going to be the JID number. We're going to skip all of this validation stuff. And now we have to think about translation. So for the DN, we want to have a translation. I think in the future grouper could figure this out automatically, but for now, let's put a script here. And basically we need a script that's going to default to the override, and if that's not there, we need a flat structure based on the base OU. So basically what we're going to try is a script. So it starts with $squiggle, ends in squiggle. This default string means if there's something in the first part, use that. If not, then use whatever's in the next part. So the first part is going to be the attribute value that is the override. So if there is an override on the group, and again, we'll see that later, this MD is metadata, and then grouper is a built-in, and this is called LDAP group DN override. So if there's something overridden, we'll use that DN. Otherwise, we want to escape the RDN value of the group name, since it's flat, and concatenate that with OU grouper groups example edu. So that should be the DN. So we'll take that and put that as the translation. And that was all one line. My editor had a break there, but it wasn't a real line break. So let's go ahead and store that in the group2id2 field for the group link. So that's going to take that DN and we'll cache that in grouper. So the next one, let's do the CN value, and we're going to have a similar type process, I think. We'll do CN for this. Value type is string. It's not multi-valued. We're going to select insert update this. It's not the matching ID. That's going to be the JID number. We're going to skip the validation. It's not going to be the search attribute. That's the JID number. And then we're going to translate this as well. Again, I think in the future grouper can do this automatically, but for now we're just going to do a similar type of script. I'm going to try this script. Basically, I took what we did for DN, and I have that right here, and I just wrapped that in a call that says LDAP convert DN to specific value, which is going to take the RDN value of that, so whatever's in the CN, and use that. So let's take that script and give that a try. After that, we can do the JID number. So that's a string. You could do number there too, but grouper will just convert things to strings, so I'm just going to leave it as a string. Not multi-valued. We'll select insert update this. We will say that this is the matching ID, which means that an object in the target that has a certain value, if that matches a grouper object that has the value for that attribute, then we'll compare those two. We'll say that this is the search attribute, which means that we're going to look up groups in LDAP by the GID number. We'll ignore all that validation. And then we'll just do a translation that's straight from the ID index of grouper. And I'll pick ID index string so that it's a string value, less things to convert. Next attribute, let's do the object class. This is a string. It is multi-valued. We're going to, oops, it's not the membership attribute. We're going to select insert update this. It's not the matching ID. We're not going to have validations. It's not the search attribute. We're going to translate this just from a script and hard code some values there. So when I look in LDAP at a group, this is group of unique names. I think I'm doing POSIX group, and I don't have that here. So basically I'm just going to hard code top and POSIX group. And then we have our membership attribute. I'm just going to use the description attribute in LDAP just to show this example. You'll probably use member or has member or whatever. This is a string. It's multi-valued. This is the membership attribute. We're going to membership sync from field. And when we get the DN of the entity, we'll put that in member2id2. So we haven't configured that part yet, but we will. So that's where it's going to be. So for entity configuration, we need to select entities. In this case, we're not going to, we can select all entities, which generally you'll want to do unless there's a ton of users in LDAP and you are only working on a small amount of them. If you're working on a good percentage of however many users you have, you probably want to select them all at once instead of selecting them in batches. We're not going to insert or delete or update entities. We're just going to look them up to get their DNs. There's no subject link because we are doing things by subject identifier 0, which we already have in grouper. And has target entity link true, we're going to get the DNs based on the subject identifier 0. So for the entity search base DN, our users are in OU equals people. So we can just grab that. For entity search filter and search all filter, we'll just let grouper do that itself, which basically is going to do a filter based on certain object classes and the base DN. And if it's a search filter for specific things, it's going to look for the subject identifier 0, which I think is the male attribute in my case. So in this case, I think we really only need two attributes here. We need the DN, which is going to be a field named name. This is a string, so we can leave that blank. It's not multi-valued. We're going to select it. It's not the matching ID. So for translation type, we're not even going to translate from grouper. We're just going to get it from LDAP. So the member sync2 field is going to be member2id2. So that was what we used for the membership attribute in the group. The value would be the DN of the users. So the second one is just going to be our matching ID and our search attribute. So this is going to be male. It's a string. It's not multi-valued in our view of it. We are selecting it. It's our matching ID. We are going to translate this from subject identifier 0. And that in our subject source is mapped to the same field, which is sort of like an EPPN type looking field. Under advanced, I just do my favorite log all objects verbose here so that I can see some output. And let's see what this is going to do. All right, so that saved successfully. Let's add a couple daemons real quick. We'll add a full sync daemon. I like to make the config ID related to the provisioning config ID just so things are organized. I'll call this one full. This is a daemon type full sync. The provisioner config ID is what we just configured. And I like to randomize these a little bit so that all the jobs don't run at the same time. So I'll just pick some random hours, minutes, and seconds. Sometime in the morning, usually I do between like 5 and 8 a.m. So let's make another one for incremental. This will be a provisioning incremental sync. Pick the provisioner config ID. This we don't need to stagger, it's just going to run at the top of the minute. And now I like to just run the full sync once just to get things sort of initialized. So we can pull up that full sync one more time. And it says error because it's never been run, but we will run it. All right, so we ran the full and there was an error, so I'm just going to show you how to troubleshoot that a little bit. So if we click on the job and go to the error logs, they're going to be listed here. Then we can open that into an editor that we can see a little bit better. Basically, the first part is like a debug map that just gives you name-value pairs of certain things that are going on, and then at the end, there's an exception, and then this part is the exception. So the exception description is why is entity search all filter empty? So basically, if you don't have a search all filter, it's going to use the search attribute in for entities, and if you don't have a search attribute, then it doesn't really know what to do. So basically, we need to come back and just reconfigure this a little bit. So we'll go back to provisioners. We'll edit this. And let's go down and make sure that we have that male attribute as the search attribute. So I'm just sort of glancing at, we're going group attributes. Here we have entities. We have the DN. And now we have this male attribute. We did set this to be the matching ID, but we did not set it to be the search attribute. So let's set that to true. And the other thing is, if we want the automatic searching of entities to look at object classes, which I think is a good idea, we might as well add another attribute here for object classes. So let's add a third entity attribute. Let's just call this object class. It's a string, it's not multi-valued. Doesn't really even matter if we select it, but we'll select it, and we'll just, again, give a hard-coded list of object classes. So when I look at LDAP at a person, there's a bunch of object classes. Let's just put object class equals person. If they have that, then should be good to go. When you make your decision on that, it might be a little bit less arbitrary, but that's what I'm going to use to get this going. So let's save that. Now let's go to the daemon jobs and kick this off again. Now it says error because it literally was an error. This success is a success because it didn't actually have to look up any users because nothing's provisionable. So the incremental technically did run successfully. The full can't because it was misconfigured. So now that it's changed, let's run it again, and we'll see if that. All right, still an error. All right, so we still had an error. Let's look one more time and see what's going on. So now it says attribute should not be a collection object class, and this is in the we're manipulating values and just making sure things are okay. So maybe one of our object classes was not marked as multi-valued. So let's go back and just look at those again. So this is the group object class, and this is marked as multi-valued. Let's skip down to the entity object class. That we just added. And we didn't mark that as multi-valued, so let's select that as multi-valued, and now the framework should be happier. Let's go back to the full daemon and kick that off again. Okay. One more thing I'll say is, right after I made the change the last time, I think the daemon didn't get a chance to update the config, so I got the same error twice. So if you can wait 10 seconds after you make a change to run it again, that won't happen. But if you ever see the same error twice and you feel like you fixed it, then just kick it off again. So that's good. Now let's make some groups in grouper. Let's make a group that will just go to the flat location. Let's make a group that will go to a custom location. Let's go to LDAP and make a group somewhere that group can go to. This isn't a POSIX group, so I don't really want to use this one. But yeah, let's make a new POSIX group. So we're going to make an existing, pretend like there's an existing policy group here. We can add some descriptions to that as well. So I've got a group with some members, and this JIT number is going to be a sticking point. So what we should do is it's going to be two cases. One, we want to create a group at an arbitrary DN. One, we want to link it up to an existing group in LDAP. So there's a couple cases here. So let's make a group in grouper that can link to this. So I made this group, and let's just grab this ID index, and we'll assign it to that group in LDAP. So that should link those up. So while I'm assigning the DN overrides, you don't want there to be a race condition where it sees that there isn't an override and then maybe it goes and deletes that group or does something else. So let's just turn off the incremental provisioner for a minute. So this thing is not running and it's not going to. The full's not going to run anytime soon. So now I can assign this test folder as provisionable. So the trick here is that the incremental is what's going to propagate these provisionable settings down to the individual groups. So we should probably take the custom DN group and just manually assign provisioning to that as well. And here we can put in a DN override for that. So let's just put something out of our flat structure, which is OU grouper groups. So maybe something like this. So this is going to go to CN equals some new custom DN in the groups OU. And then let's take an existing custom DN and we'll mark that as provisionable, and that's going to go to this group that we just created, some existing policy group. So we'll save that. Now let's turn the incremental back on, that things are configured right. By the way, the only reason that we need to turn the incremental off is that we labeled the folder as provisionable. If you take a group that's completely either not provisionable or not in a provisionable folder, then you wouldn't have to do that. So let's enable that. Of course, it hasn't run for a while. So that'll run at the top of the minute. Okay, we still have an error here because it doesn't like a DN override with a group that doesn't exist in LDAP. In the future we can fix that in Grouper, but for now let's just make sure all the groups exist in LDAP. So we have this one. Which is some new custom DN in group. So I created that in LDAP. So now let's try to run it and see what happens. Okay, I tweaked the translation scripts a little bit and now things are looking good. Let's check LDAP and see what that looks like. So we've got OU grouper groups. This group was created. We've got OU equals groups. These two groups. All right, let's start with test folder test group. Let's add a couple people. Let's go to custom DN. let's go to existing custom DN. Let's make sure that daemon is running. So we have test group existing custom DN. Some existing policy group. And this has A. D. Anderson and A.J. Scott. And let's just check the JIB number. 1046. Turns out I had provision no under this, so I'm just going to set it to yes. And now let's try it one more time. And now we have some adds and deletes. And now everything looks good.